I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly, its barren expanse shimmering under a merciless sun. The horizon seemed to melt into the sky, a mirage of heat and distance that blurred reality. For Joe Hargrove, the foreman of the Desert Star housing project, it was just another day of moving Earth. Or at least, it should have been. The bulldozer struck something below the surface, a hollow sound that echoed unnaturally, even through the din of engines. It wasn't rock or compacted soil, the typical resistance they were used to. This was something else. "Shut it down!" Joe barked, waving his arms at the operators. The machinery groaned to a halt, and a strange stillness settled over the site. "What did we hit?" one of the workers, a burly man named Reggie, called out, wiping sweat from his brow. Joe crouched near the jagged hole, peering into the darkness that was both earthy and metallic, like rusted iron left to decay. He shivered despite the heat. "Get me a light," Joe said, his voice tight. A flashlight was passed down, its beam piercing the black void. The hole widened into a cavern below, its walls glistening as though coated in oil. But it was the carvings that stopped Joe cold. Spirals, lines, and geometric patterns adorned the stone, each glowing faintly with a sickly green light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. He stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Jesus," Reggie muttered, peering over his shoulder. "What the hell is that?" "Don't know," Joe said, his throat dry. "But we're not touching it until someone figures it out," geologist Peter Caraway, a man known for tackling the impossible. Peter arrived the following evening, his wiry frame and sharp features softened only by the exhaustion etched into his face. The desert was no stranger to him. He had spent years chasing myths and whispers buried in the sand. But something about Joe's voice on the phone had unsettled him. As the foreman met him at the site, the sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the desert. "Thanks for coming, Doc," Joe said, extending a calloused hand. "Sounded urgent," Peter replied, adjusting his pack. "You mentioned carvings?" Joe nodded grimly. "You'll want to see for yourself." They lowered Peter into the cavern on a makeshift harness. As his boots touched the ground, he felt a strange vibration beneath his feet. The air was cool, unnaturally so, and carried that same metallic tang Joe had described, tail. They weren't merely decorative, they told a story. Spirals converged into shapes resembling humanoid figures, their arms raised in what Peter could only describe as supplication. Between them stood a larger figure, its form indistinct but radiating menace. Peter's heart raced as he moved closer. The glyphs weren't just art, they were warnings. "This isn't just ancient," he murmured to himself. "It's deliberate." The walls were alive with vines or roots that pulsed faintly, as if carrying blood instead of sap. He reached out, hesitating before his fingers brushed the surface. The vine recoiled with a shudder, and a low hum filled the cavern. Peter stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. "What the hell?" Cut out his sketches and photographs in the makeshift tent provided by the construction crew. The glyphs were unlike anything he had seen before, neither Native American nor any known civilization. But as he pored over them, patterns began to emerge. The central figure, larger and more ominous than the others, was surrounded by concentric circles. These circles were etched with jagged lines, depicting fire, water, and blood. Below the figure, smaller carvings showed what could only be interpreted as sacrifice, human figures kneeling before the larger entity, their forms dissolving into spirals. "It's a ritual," Peter said aloud, his voice tinged with dread. Joe entered the tent, his face pale. "Doc, you better come see this." Peter followed Joe to the edge of the cavern. The vines had begun to spread, creeping upward and outward like veins on a corpse. Aching. Peter knelt to examine them. The pulsations had grown stronger, the rhythm almost hypnotic. He reached out again, this time with a gloved hand. When he touched the vine, a vision exploded in his mind. He saw the desert as it once was, lush and green, teeming with life. But then came the darkness. A shadow fell over the land, and with it, the figure from the carvings, the feeder. It moved like smoke, devouring everything in its path. The vision ended with fire and blood, and the shadow being forced into the cavern, trapped by those who had sacrificed their own lives to seal it away. Peter gasped, pulling his hand back. "It's not just a story," he whispered. "It's a prison." The awakening, despite Peter's warnings, the construction company ordered work to continue. Time was money, and they had investors breathing down their necks. The crew worked reluctantly, their unease growing with each passing hour. Workers reported hearing whispers coming from the cavern, voices that spoke in a language no one understood. Shadows moved where there should have been none, and the air grew colder. Then came the first disappearance. Reggie, the burly worker who had helped uncover the cavern, vanished during a routine inspection. His hard hat was found near the cavern's edge, its surface smeared with a dark, viscous substance that smelled of decay. Peter confronted Joe in the tent. "You have to shut this down," he said, slamming his hands on the table. "This isn't just an archaeological site. It's a gateway." Joe looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot. "You think I don't know that? But the suits don't care. They just want their damn housing development." Before Peter could respond, a scream tore through the night. They ran outside to find another worker standing at the cavern's edge, his eyes wide with terror. The feeder emerged as the vines now covered the surrounding area, their pulsations growing faster, more erratic. The air vibrated with a low-frequency hum that made Peter's teeth ache. As night fell, the ground trembled. From the cavern emerged a shadow, amorphous and shifting, its tendrils reaching out like hungry fingers. The feeder was neither fully corporeal nor entirely ethereal, it existed somewhere in between, a being of light and darkness. Peter and the remaining crew fled to the tent, but the feeder followed, its presence suffocating. It didn't simply consume, it corrupted. The crew began turning on each other, their fear amplified to hysteria. The wind howled like a banshee in mourning, rattling the windows of the research outpost with an unrelenting ferocity. The blizzard had descended without warning, its icy tendrils snaring the isolated facility in a death grip. Outside, the world was a white void, a frozen purgatory where sight and sound were swallowed whole. Dr. Rachel Ferris stood at the observation window, her breath fogging the glass. She was a biologist, not a survivalist, but she had spent enough time in Alaska's unforgiving wilderness to know that storms like this were killers. The wind chill could freeze exposed skin in seconds, and no rescue would come until the blizzard relented. "It's bad out there," said Kevin Delaney, a geologist with a wiry build and nervous energy. He leaned against the wall, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos. "Satellite's down, and the weather station says we've got another 36 hours of this." Rachel nodded, her gaze fixed on the swirling snow. The others milled about the common area. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the team's climatologist, was methodically documenting the storm's progression. Carter Finn, the rugged expedition leader, sat sharpening a knife with quiet intensity. And then there was Dr. Alan Keene, the team's ecologist, who had been uncharacteristically silent all day, his pale face betraying a tension that set Rachel on edge. The air inside the outpost was thick with an unspoken unease. It wasn't just the storm. Something else had unsettled them, a feeling Rachel couldn't quite name. The vanishing when the power flickered that evening, the team gathered in the generator room. The lights dimmed and surged, casting their faces in ghostly shades of yellow and gray. "Fuel reserves are fine," Carter muttered, checking the gauges. "Might be ice in the intake." He nodded. "If I can get to the intake valve outside." Kevin raised a skeptical eyebrow. "In this storm? You'd be frozen solid before you got 10 feet. Carter smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll manage." Rachel didn't argue. Carter was the kind of man who thrived in adversity, but even he seemed rattled as he bundled into his parka and goggles. The others watched in silence as he opened the airlock and stepped into the blizzard. The minutes dragged on. "He should be back by now," Elena said, her voice trembling. Rachel checked her watch. 15 minutes had passed. Too long. "I'm going out there," Alan said suddenly, pulling on his gear. "No, you're not," Rachel snapped. "If Carter," the sound cut her off. A low, guttural groan, barely audible over the howling wind, emanated from outside. "What was that?" Kevin whispered. At first, she saw nothing but the swirling snow. Then, something moved, a shadow, amorphous and unsettling, slipping across the periphery of the floodlights. "It's Carter," Alan said, stepping closer. "No," Rachel said, her voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't." The predator Carter's body was found the next morning, sprawled 20 feet from the airlock. His face was frozen in a mask of terror, his goggles cracked, and his parka shredded. Blood stained the snow in a grotesque spiral around him, but there were no tracks leading to or from his body. Rachel knelt beside him, her breath catching in her throat. His wounds weren't consistent with any predator she knew of, not a bear, not a wolf. The cuts were too precise, the flesh too cleanly removed. "It's not natural," Alan said, his voice shaking. Kevin backed away, pale as the snow. "What do you mean, not natural? What could do this?" Rachel stood, her jaw tight. Words hung in the air like frost, and for a moment, no one spoke. Paranoia sets and the storm raged on, trapping them in the outpost with no means of escape and no contact with the outside world. Tensions rose, paranoia thickening the air like smoke. That night, Rachel heard something moving in the ventilation shafts. A faint scraping, almost too soft to notice, but it sent chills down her spine. She lay awake, clutching a flashlight like a talisman, her ears straining for the sound of footsteps. By morning, Kevin was gone. "Where the hell is he?" Elena demanded, her voice cracking. "Maybe he went outside," Alan offered, though he didn't sound convinced. Rachel shook her head. "Why would he do that? He wouldn't survive 2 minutes out there." But Kevin's boots were missing, and the airlock showed signs of recent use. Rachel and Elena discovered something buried beneath the snow near the outpost. A fissure in the ice led to a cavern below, its walls glistening with frost and something darker, an organic substance that pulsed faintly, like veins under translucent skin. Within the cavern, they found Kevin. Or what was left of him. His body hung suspended in the icy walls, his face twisted in an expression of horror. But as Rachel moved closer, Kevin's eyes opened. She stumbled back, her heart racing. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear, but his body remained encased in ice. Then his face changed, melting into something alien, inhuman. "We need to leave," Elena whispered, her voice shaking. "It's adapting," Rachel said, her mind racing. "It mimics its prey to lure others in." Climax: the creature infiltrated the outpost, mimicking the team members it had already killed. It moved among them like a ghost, exploiting their paranoia and fear, not even herself. When Alan attacked Elena, Rachel understood the horrifying truth. Alan had been taken by the creature, his form now a perfect imitation. She killed him in self-defense, but the act shattered the fragile trust within the group. In the end, Rachel was the only one left. She devised a desperate plan to lure the creature into the generator room and ignite the fuel reserves, sacrificing herself to destroy it. Resolution: as the outpost burned, the blizzard began to lift. A rescue team arrived days later, finding only the charred remains of the facility. The official report attributed the tragedy to a catastrophic fuel explosion. But beneath the snow, deep in the ice, something stirred. Edgar Wolfe never expected to inherit anything. He was a man who had spent his life in service to rules, order, and discipline, first as a soldier and later as a prison warden. His days were long and unremarkable, his nights quiet and solitary. At 72, he lived in a small bungalow surrounded by stacks of old crime novels and photo albums he rarely opened. So, when the letter arrived, a crisp envelope with an embossed seal bearing the name Wolfe Estate, he dismissed it as a mistake. He nearly tossed it into the trash, but paused, something about the bold strokes of his name drawing his curiosity. The letter revealed that he had a great-uncle, a man named Reginald Wolfe, who had passed away and left Edgar a sprawling mansion in a remote part of New Hampshire. Edgar had never heard of Reginald Wolfe. The mansion was a relic of another era, its Gothic spires clawing at the overcast sky like skeletal fingers. And the heavy weight of skepticism. The property was miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense woods that whispered with the sound of rustling leaves and unseen creatures. Inside, the mansion was a labyrinth of narrow hallways, creaking floorboards, and rooms filled with dust-covered relics. The air smelled faintly of cedar and decay, and the walls seemed to absorb sound, rendering every noise an eerie echo. On the second night, as Edgar explored the house, he found a peculiar key in an ornate wooden box in the library. It was unlike any he had ever seen, heavy, made of a dark, silvery metal that gleamed faintly in the dim light. A small brass tag hung from it, engraved with the words, "Do not use." Cryptic, Edgar muttered to himself, turning the key over in his hands. But curiosity gnawed at him, and despite his better judgment, he slipped it into his pocket, discovered the door in the basement. He had been searching for the source of a faint, rhythmic humming that seemed to emanate from below. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, its walls lined with ancient stone and shelves filled with jars of unidentifiable contents. The door was unremarkable at first glance, simple, wooden, and weathered. But as Edgar approached, he felt a peculiar warmth emanating from it, a stark contrast to the chilly air around him. He tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Instinctively, he reached into his pocket and retrieved the ornate key. The moment it touched the lock, a vibration traveled up his arm, and the door clicked open with a smoothness that belied its age. Beyond the door was a shimmering, swirling portal, its surface like liquid silver, and fascination. It looked like something out of a science fiction novel, yet it was undeniably real. The other side cautiously, Edgar stepped through the portal, his breath catching as the world around him shifted. The air was warm and fragrant, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass. He emerged in what appeared to be a utopian version of Earth. The sky was a vivid blue, the sun brighter but less harsh, and the landscape a patchwork of lush greenery and sparkling water. People moved about with an air of contentment, their laughter and conversation creating a harmonious symphony. Edgar wandered for hours, marveling at the perfection of this place. It was as if all the ugliness of his world, the violence, the suffering, the chaos, had been erased. He felt a strange pull, a desire to stay. But as night fell, Edgar noticed something unsettling. The laughter stopped, colors of the landscape seemed to dim. Shadows began to creep across the land, and a low, guttural sound echoed in the distance. Edgar turned to leave, only to find a figure standing behind him. It was a man, or at least, it looked like one. His face was too smooth, his eyes too reflective, and his smile too wide. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, its voice an unsettling blend of tones. Edgar stumbled back, his heart pounding. He fled toward the portal, the figure's footsteps echoing behind him. The intruder back in the mansion, Edgar slammed the basement door shut and locked it. His chest heaved as he leaned against the cold stone wall, trying to make sense of what he had seen. But he wasn't alone. As he ascended the stairs, he heard soft, deliberate footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting to see the empty staircase, but instead, he saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was the man from the other side. His throat as the figure stepped into the light. Its face was no longer human. The smooth features had dissolved into a mass of shifting, black tendrils that pulsed and writhed like living shadows. "You brought me here," it said, its voice no longer resembling speech but a collection of guttural sounds that scraped against Edgar's mind. The trap over the following days, Edgar learned the horrifying truth. The portal wasn't a doorway to another world. It was a lure, a baited trap set by an ancient intelligence that sought to invade Earth. The creature he had brought back was just the beginning. The mansion became a battleground as Edgar tried to contain the entity, which had the ability to mimic his voice, his face, and even his memories. It whispered to him in the night, tempting him with promises of power and immortality. But Edgar was no stranger to manipulation, instincts, and he refused to be swayed. The climax, the final confrontation, took place in the basement, where Edgar devised a desperate plan to force the creature back through the portal. Armed with a can of gasoline, a box of matches, and a lifetime of grit, he lured the entity to the door. As the creature lunged, Edgar set the room ablaze. The fire consumed everything, the heat and smoke choking the air as the portal collapsed in on itself, pulling the creature back into the void. The aftermath: Edgar escaped the mansion, coughing and covered in soot. The fire raged behind him, consuming the house and its secrets. Weeks later, as he sat in his bungalow, he received another letter, this one from a lawyer representing the Wolf estate. Enclosed was a second key, identical to the first, with a note that read, "There is always another door." The fields of Stillwater stretched endlessly under a lavender dusk sky, their rows of wheat and corn swaying gently in the breeze. To Tess Monroe, it looked like something out of an old country postcard, too pristine, too perfect. She sat behind the wheel of her car, parked on the edge of town, staring at the quaint wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Stillwater, where the land always provides." "Charming," Tess muttered, snapping a photo of the sign with her phone. As an investigative journalist, Tess had seen plenty of small towns. Most were struggling, their economies gutted by corporate farming or urban migration. Stillwater, however, was different. The town was thriving, its crops unusually lush and plentiful despite the challenges faced by most of the Midwest. Locals whispered about Stillwater's magic soil, but rumors of the town's insularity, and a few disappearances over the years, had piqued Tess's curiosity. Story, calling it conspiracy bait. But Tess had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts told her something was wrong here. First impression: Stillwater was as picturesque up close as it was from a distance. The streets were lined with tidy cottages, their gardens bursting with flowers. The townsfolk greeted her warmly, their smiles wide and genuine. But their eyes lingered a beat too long, and Tess couldn't shake the feeling that they were sizing her up. At the local diner, Tess introduced herself to the waitress, a plump woman named Maggie with ruddy cheeks and a cheerful demeanor. "You're just passing through?" Maggie asked, her tone light but probing. "Actually, I'm a reporter," Tess said, flipping open her notebook. "I'm working on a piece about farming communities. Stillwater's success is remarkable. What's your secret?" Maggie's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning in full force. "Nothing much to tell." As Tess pressed for more details, Maggie deflected with practiced ease. The rest of the patrons seemed equally unwilling to talk. It wasn't until later, when Tess was checking into the town's only inn, that an older man approached her outside. "You won't find what you're looking for here," he said, his voice a low rasp. "They won't let you." Before Tess could respond, the man slipped away into the shadows, leaving her with a growing sense of unease. The first clue that night, Tess awoke to a faint humming sound. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she listened closer, she realized it was coming from beneath the floor. The sound was rhythmic, almost alive, and it sent shivers down her spine. As she wandered through the rows, she noticed something unusual. The roots of the plants glowed faintly, a soft, eerie luminescence that pulsed like a heartbeat. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Tess turned to see a man standing behind her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and piercing blue eyes. "Name's John Carter," he said, extending a hand. I manage this farm. Tess introduced herself and asked about the glowing roots, but John brushed it off. Just a trick of the sunlight, he said, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. Tess stayed in Stillwater longer than planned. She noticed the same glowing roots in every field and heard the same rhythmic hum beneath every building. The townsfolk grew increasingly wary of her questions, their friendly smiles turning cold. One evening, while exploring the woods near the edge of town, Tess stumbled upon a hidden trapdoor covered with moss. It led to a network of tunnels beneath the fields, their walls lined with thick, glowing roots. The air was damp and heavy, filled with the hum she had heard before. As Tess ventured deeper, she found something horrifying: human remains entangled in the roots, their faces twisted in agony. The roots pulsed as if feeding, and Tess realized the truth: the town's prosperity came at a terrible cost. The roots weren't just sustaining the crops, they were sustaining the town itself, drawing life from anyone who tried to leave or resist the organism, their lives inextricably tied to its survival. Escape. When Tess tried to flee, the townsfolk turned on her. They cornered her in the tunnels, their faces expressionless, their movements unnervingly synchronized. "You don't understand," John said, stepping forward. "The roots provide for us. They keep us alive, keep us strong. All they ask in return is a little sacrifice." Tess fought back, using her camera flash to blind them temporarily. She managed to escape the tunnels and reach her car, but the townsfolk were close behind, their silhouettes appearing in her rearview mirror as she sped down the dark road. The climax: as Tess reached the highway, her car sputtered to a halt. The glowing roots had wrapped around the tires, growing impossibly fast. Tess grabbed a can of gasoline from the trunk and set the car ablaze, the fire severing the roots long enough for her to escape on foot. But when they returned to Stillwater, the town was gone. The fields were barren, the buildings abandoned, and there was no sign of the glowing roots. The aftermath: Tess published her story, but it was dismissed as fiction, a desperate attempt to revive her fading career. Yet she knew what she had seen, and she knew the organism wasn't gone. It was simply waiting, growing, spreading. Months later, while driving through another small farming town, Tess noticed something familiar: fields of impossibly lush crops and a faint hum beneath the ground. The roots had found a new home.
If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting just for you.